As a parent, how do you explain to your children that their mum or dad has taken their own life? And then guide and support them through the legacy and grief implicit in that action? Well, that's what we're talking about in this episode of Speaking of Suicide. As always, if you find the discussion too difficult, do press pause. You'll find the contact details for Mikeysline in the show notes, and I'll give them out at the end of the episode if you need some support. 10 years ago, Aileen Rore's husband Josh died by suicide, leaving Aileen to bring up their 3 young children, Alex, Mason and Hamish. Hamish is now 18 and has decided he'd like to take part in this episode alongside his mum, so I'm sitting here with both of you. Hamish, if I can turn to you just on that point, why did you decide you'd like to get involved in this and have a voice in this?
My mum's always been kind of not pushy, but asked us to kind of talk about it, but I've never really known how to kind of go about asking questions and what to ask. So I thought that this would be kind of a good way to go about doing that.
This will be interesting then. Aileen, you're wincing slightly there. I should say, this is an opportunity for you to ask each other questions as well as, I'm going to be here asking questions. But I think that's, if we're a vehicle for you to be able to unpack some of this, Hamish, I think that's a brilliant way of doing it. How much have you talked about it?
My mum was always very open about it. She never lied about what happened. But we never really... I don't really remember a lot of what happened. But I feel like we were kind of... we spoke about some of this, some stuff, but it's particularly when we moved up here, I don't feel like we really spoke about much of it.
I think I probably did try and encourage, I would have said more than push, you to talk about things, but it was difficult to know how much to encourage and without being pushy and without forcing it. And it was a horrible time, and they were so young that it was about trying to let you come to me when you were ready, rather than me pushing you when I felt that maybe you should be talking.
Well, I think it's great that you're happy to take part, Hamish. I think that's fantastic. As I say, if there's any questions you want to ask each other, feel free to take the reins of this episode and just make it what you need or want it to be. I think if we start, though, Aileen, by rolling back a bit to telling us a bit about Josh, how you met maybe, and what he was like.
Josh and I met in Australia. So he was Australian. I was out in Australia travelling with one of my school friends, and we found ourselves at a ski resort of all places in Australia, and he was the chef. And he was just in our group of friends, and we worked closely together, all of us. There was about 15 of us, and then just over that sort of 4-month period, things sort of developed between myself and Josh. And at the end of the 12 months in Australia, my friend came home, and I did not. And I stayed on for another few months. I'd managed to get the owners of the hotel to sponsor me to stay. And then that relationship soured, so I actually had to leave. And Josh and I decided, well, let's get married. So we did. So I came home in December 2004 to say to my mum and dad, by the way, this is what's happening. So I went back to Australia in 2005, and we got married on Easter Monday in 2005. And in a little town in northeast Victoria called Wangaratta. And then, and I stayed out there until 2008. So by that point, Hamish was born. He was born out in Melbourne, where we were living at the time. And then the 3 of us moved back to Scotland in May 2008.
And what was Josh like?
He was very funny. And he was very warm and open with people, and he had a lot of friends. He was, he was just one of those people. People enjoyed being around him, and then he became a father, and things changed.
Do you have many memories of him, Hamish?
I remember kind of random bits here and there. I remember going to the park with him. I remember his restaurant that he owned here. Going there for like breakfast, lunch, dinner a few times. I've got random memories of that. Like sometimes when like him coming home from work or him going out like before he owned the restaurant. I remember him taking me to the place that he worked before that, Doors. I remember him taking me out there one time. But other than that, that's about it.
So snippets. I can officially say, according to my daughter, he made the best French toast
Yes.
that anyone
Yes.
had ever made anywhere.
Mhm.
Because she used to come along to the restaurant when she was very little, and that's all she wanted was your dad's French toast. Was her absolute, the ultimate meal for my daughter B.
Yeah, we ate like kings at home. We did.
I bet you did. He was a fabulous chef.
Yeah.
He was a fabulous chef. At what point, Aileen, did mental health issues come into this? How early on did you realise that he had some challenges?
Hindsight's a great thing, and looking back, I can see that there were flags very, very early on. But at the time, I think it was when we moved to Scotland. I remember we moved to Scotland and we were staying at my mum and dad's on the west coast, and he was offered a job in Inverness, and the night before he started that job he was drinking very, very heavily, and I remember looking out the window into the back garden very late on in the evening and him just pacing around the garden with a cigarette in one hand and a bottle of beer in the other, and I remember thinking, that's not how I would have sort of conducted myself the night before I started a new job, and then there was other things that sort of came sort of later, but he was drinking heavily that was the first time I kind of noticed the drinking as being not quite what I would say was normal, regular drinking behaviour, and but like I said, it sort of over the next, what would it have been, 6 years, 5-6 years, it sort of escalated.
And what kind of impact did that have on you and the family?
I remember my mum and dad coming to visit us when we'd moved house and we were living down in the town at that point, and they came to visit us and they made a comment about the empty bottles that were in the recycling box at the back door. And I remember being mortified, and because it wasn't me, and they knew it wouldn't have been me because I had a baby at the time, so I was breastfeeding, so I wasn't drinking, but they also had seen that the previous week that had been empty. So I remember I remember being so loyal to Josh that I sort of covered for him in a way. I said, oh, well, he works really hard. He's working till 11 o'clock at night. He's only off 1 or 2 days a week. He needs some time to just unwind. And I explained it away, knowing full well that what I was saying wasn't necessarily correct or how I felt.
I mean, you describe it there as unwinding, but did you ever get a sense of what was lay underneath the drinking, of why Josh drank?
No. I don't know. I suppose I wondered maybe at the time whether it was moving to Scotland. He did drink in Australia, there was no doubt about that, but I became more aware of it in Scotland. So I suppose I did wonder whether that was something to do with it. He was he'd never lived overseas. He'd never even, I think he'd been on holiday to Hong Kong once, and other than that, all his holidays were in Australia. And suddenly he was living on the other side of the world, away from all of his friends and his family and this new culture. And that maybe he was just not happy with his new situation. But he never voiced it. He never gave any indication that he wasn't happy, that he wanted to move back home. And when we talked about moving over to Scotland in the first place, it was not a done deal. It was a conversation. I would like to do this. What are your thoughts? Yes, I'm in. Let's do it. It wasn't forced upon him.
Now, I know when Josh took his life, you weren't together as a couple, although you saw lots of each other. But what had prompted that rift?
The separation. Well, we had a business. We had a restaurant in the town, the Larder, and it was his dream. He'd run a business with his brother and his father when he was in his 20s, and they'd had it for a few years, and it was always his dream to get back to being his own boss and running his own show. And a venue came up in Inverness, and he said it was the right time, right place, right location, and got me to come along and have a look at it, and I could see the potential. I could see what it could be, and I knew how good he was at what he did. And there was nothing else like what his vision was in Inverness at the time. So we opened this business and we ran it, and it did not take off the way that we had hoped. And a Saturday was booming in that place. Sometimes you couldn't get a table. We were turning people away. But the rest of the week, we were so quiet, and it was just draining money. And eventually we had no option but to close the doors, and that, I think, broke him. But before that happened, it was open for 18 months, and over that 18-month period, as business did not pick up and take off the way he had envisaged it would, he turned more and more to alcohol. I mean, I remember getting a text message from our manager, because I had Mason, the youngest. He was only 3 at the time, so my involvement was just looking after the finances. So I would look after the payroll and all the accounting. And so I was at home, and I remember getting a text message from the manager to say that Josh had been drinking, and at this point it was sort of 11:30 in the day. And then when she left a few weeks later, and when she left, she told me that he was drinking every day. And I didn't believe her. I refused to believe it. But then over the course of the next sort of 6 or 8 months, more staff were telling me that he was drinking. And I remember walking into the kitchen one day, walking into the larder, and the member of staff that was there said, "He's drunk." I went up the stairs, found him in the office and clearly inebriated, and stormed down the stairs, walked into the kitchen, and then set about looking for the alcohol, and found it beside the cheese in the cold cupboard, a half-empty bottle of red wine. And that, for me, like I tried reaching out to him to get him to sort of face up to the problem, but he wouldn't. And then after about 6 months of that, I got to the end of the road for me. I couldn't do it anymore. And I had the 3 kids, and he was coming home drunk every night, and he wasn't a nice person when he was drunk, and I could take it because I was an adult and I was his wife, and this was for better and for worse. But then there were elements where it was shifting to the kids, and he would say things to them, and at that point I reached out to his sister, because his sister was a recovering alcoholic and his father was an alcoholic as well. And his brother, one of his brothers, has issues with alcohol. So I reached out to his sister, and his sister said, "You need to get him out of the house." And at that point, I asked him to meet me, and we had a conversation. I said, "You need to leave," and he did. He didn't sort of fight me on it or anything, but he left, and so that was how the relationship broke down, and how the sort of how we separated.
Do you have any memories, Hamish, of that time?
Not really. I think I might have, but I just didn't realise what was going on at the time. Like Mum said, he was working like all the time, so he was very rarely at the house, and when he was, it was late at night, so I was already in bed. But I don't remember him ever saying anything to us or being drunk at the house. But that would have been just because I was so young.
Incredibly difficult to navigate a partner or a husband with a problem and bringing up the 3 children. How much did you worry about the impact on him of you asking him to leave? Did you have concerns that he'd ever take his life?
Not when I asked him to leave. When I asked him to leave, I think I genuinely thought this would be the kick up the arse he needed to get himself sorted. Or maybe I just hoped that was what it was going to be. I'm not sure. I thought that the relationship was salvageable, but he was still obviously somebody I cared very much about. He was the father of my children, and I wanted us to, if we couldn't be together and parent together, I wanted us to be separate and continue to co-parent. Whether that was just me being like unrealistic, I don't know, but I wanted him to get his life together and be the parent that I knew he could be. But I did never think that he was going to go ahead and do what he did. Not at that time, not in September 2013.
You say not at that time, which suggests that there did shift in terms of your concerns about his mental health.
Yes. So over the next few months, he moved into emergency accommodation, and he had no money because the business had closed the doors. He didn't have a job. So I made sure I had him round for dinner, most nights of the week, so that he could spend time with his kids, and also so that I knew that he was eating properly. But I remember we separated. He moved out in September, and by Christmas I'd had reason to worry about his mental health and where he was at, and I'd called the police to say that I was concerned. He had sent me a text message that I can't remember now what the wording of that message was, but it was along the lines of that, to look after my kids, and I can't, there's nothing more I can do. It didn't say that he had done anything, and it didn't say that he was going to do something. It just was a little bit too final, and it made myself, I just felt there was something not right. So I called the police and I explained the situation, and I said, I don't know if there's anything you can do, but I'm just really worried. And they said that they would go round to where he was staying. I told them where he was staying. They said they would go round. I then reached out to my cousin, who was a good friend of Josh's, and he then started trying to get in touch with Josh. And we managed to make contact with him and convince him to go back to his accommodation where the police were waiting. And it was all fine. He went back there, he spoke to them briefly, and they left, and it was fine. But it happened again a few weeks, maybe a couple of months later, and this time they took him to Raigmore. And the the mental health nurse or consultant or practitioner, whoever it was, phoned me. And she said that she'd had a conversation with Josh, but she didn't think that he was a danger to himself, that it sounded like he was just having a bad day. And I said that it wasn't a bad day, that this was something that had happened before, that he'd threatened us before, and that I had real worries. And her response was to send him back to our house as a safe place to be. And I refused. And I said it might be a safe place for him because it's warm and there's comfort, but I've got 3 children and this relationship is not this is not a safe place for him, for all of us, for the 5 of us. I don't really know how to describe it better, but there was just no way I was having him coming back to the house. And so they released him. They took him back to his accommodation and let him go about his business. And that would have been, I think, maybe January, February time. And then there was nothing further. He seemed to be... He was going for job interviews. I paid for bus fares because by this point he'd had to sell the car. I paid for his bus fares and things to get to job interviews, and was still feeding him, still having him round for dinner. Maybe not as regularly, but all these little things that were happening over that time were sort of chipping away at the relationship that we had when we'd separated, and it was becoming a lot more strained. And then on Good Friday, so April the 18th, there was a knock at the door, and it was the police to tell us that he'd been found.
Can you remember what your immediate feelings and response were to that?
Well, I remember what I was doing. I was fixing a hanging bracket at the front door of my house. It was coming loose and I was sort of tightening the screws. My dad was at the side gate fixing the gate, which was also coming off its hinges. The kids were in the back garden playing with their granny, and I saw out the corner of my eye, because our front door was actually at the side of the house, and I saw a police car slowing down and pulling up out front. And I remember thinking, what's he done now? And because we'd had the police at the house a couple of times over the previous 3 or 4 years. And so I walked to the front gate because I thought, I'm not having my parents hear this. I walked to the front gate, and I remember standing at the front gate, and it was a policeman and a policewoman, and they said, are you Aileen Doherty? And I said, yes. And I said, is this about Josh? And they said, yes. And I said, well, what's he done? Can we come in? And I was like, no, I think you can speak to me here. And no, I think it's best we come in. And I remember thinking, oh, for goodness sake. So brought them into the house and they sat down. And I remember I wouldn't even sit on the sofa. I perched on the arm of the sofa, and they told me that they'd found him and that he had taken his own life. And my first reaction was, how do you know it was him? And I asked them, I said, how do you know it was him? And they said, because they had identification. He had identification on him. And I said, but do you know for sure? And they said, yes, we're sure. And I said, can I see him so I can be sure? And they said no. I remember that, them saying no. And then I remember the kids came in. I think it was your brother or your sister came in, and I said, on you go, you can't be here. And whoever it was said, what's going on? Why are the police here? And I remember saying, oh, Granny was speeding.
it was Lexi. I remember her coming. We were in the back garden, and Lexi came out and she said, "Oh, the police are here." And we were like, "Why?" And she was like, "Oh, Granny's been caught speeding." Completely throwing her under the bus.
And I just thought I was going to get rid of them. Actually, it was the first thing that came into my head. But of course, because I'd said what I'd said, next thing, my mum and dad came in. "What's going on?" And I was like, it's fine, I'll be out in a minute. And my mum went out, but my dad stayed. And yeah, then they sort of told us the circumstances and you know, where he had been found and how and yeah, and sort of explained briefly some next steps, and then they left.
Hamish, how did you find out what happened?
I think after they left, I think you had sat us down, or I don't know how long after they'd left.
It was Good Friday, and I wanted them to have one last Easter Sunday where they were innocent of trauma. So I did not want, we had my cousin, the one that I mentioned that was close to Josh, every year he would have a big Easter egg hunt for all the family, and I didn't want the kids going with this hanging over their heads, so I wanted them to have that one last one. So I waited, and on Easter Monday I sat them down individually and I spoke to each of them individually to explain what had happened. And so you had a couple of extra days of normality before you found out.
Can you remember that talk?
I think I remember. We were in the sitting room, I think.
No, we were in your bedroom. We were sitting on your bed, in the twin.
Where me and
twin
Mason
bed,
shared the room.
Yeah.
I know that you've not told us how it happened, and I don't want to know, because it's not going to change anything. But I don't remember, the actual conversation.
Aileen, do you remember what you said?
I don't remember exactly what I said, to be honest. I know that I told each of them that their dad had taken his own life, that he was in a really, really dark, bad place, and he couldn't see a way forward and he couldn't find his way back. And so he did something to end his life. And that's what I told each of you. Like I say, separately, you got upset, and it was the only time that I saw you upset. You kind of became quite stoic, or quite brave. You put on such a brave face after that. But that first night, the first Monday when I told you, that was the only time that I saw you upset over it. You didn't ask any questions. You didn't ask why he had done it, or what he had done. You just very much sort of absorbed what I said and took it in.
How important was it to you, Aileen, that right from the get-go you explained that Josh had taken his own life, that it wasn't that the kids had just their dad had died, but that it was by suicide?
It was extremely important. I don't know why. Other than the only way I can maybe explain it is that there had been so many lies in my relationship with Josh. When not long after we got married, I found things out about criminal records and all the rest of it, money, debt, And that dishonesty, I think, changed me. And I was determined that I was going to be the most honest and truthful with these three people that I brought into the world. That, you know, they came into the world innocent and perfect in my eyes, and that I was going to do everything to protect them going forward. And I was not going to have them thinking I had ever lied to them. That as hard as it might be to hear the truth, that it was important that they know it. That fast forward 10 years, you don't know what the teenage years are going to be like when you have children. And I mean, I remember my own teenage years, and I think they were fairly tame in comparison to some teenagers. But I did not want to have a troubling teenage period where my children were also blaming me or hating me for lying to them, or for it to come out at some point in the future. It was just, I think it wasn't even a decision. I just knew in my heart that they had to know the truth.
Hamish, how do you feel about that truth now? I mean, now you're 18, looking back on that 8-year-old self, are you, I don't want to use the word glad because it's the wrong kind of word, but how do you feel about the honesty that was handed you at that point, albeit incredibly difficult, clearly, for your mum to do?
I'm very, as you said, glad's not the right word, but I'm thankful that she was truthful. As I've grown up and kind of gotten to know my mum more, especially I found truth, it seems to be a very important thing to my mum. She's never lied to any of us, and I feel like if she had told us something else, I don't know, something else, then this year she had told me that wasn't the case, or I had found out from someone else, it slipped from someone else's mouth, I would have been doubting everything that she'd said to me in the past. So I'm very thankful that she kind of took that step and told me the truth.
At the age of 8, did the fact that your dad had died by suicide, did it register as being of significance, or was there a certain point when, or ever, that his having taken his own life kind of hit home somehow?
I don't think that when I was 8 I really understood. I knew that he wasn't going to be coming back, and that he was gone, and that he was dead. I understood that, but not the significance of how he was dead. And it has kind of hit me in random points where I've realised he's not going to be there to help me with this. My friends, their dad has helped them with stuff like driving or stuff like that, and I've realised, oh crap, I don't have that. But I think my mum's done an amazing job, being there, and they've got their dad to help them with driving. I've got an okay driver to help me with.
You passed with a clean sheet.
I'm wondering, because you learnt about your dad's suicide when you were so young, I'm wondering whether you've negated the stigma that sometimes, I guess, people do feel around suicide. And I'm wondering whether, from either of you, whether you think by making it so open so young that actually you've pushed back some of that potential stigma. What do you think, Aileen?
I remember they actually went back to school the day after they were told. So they were told on Easter Monday, school reopened on the Tuesday, and they went back to school on the Tuesday. I wanted them to have respite from what was going on in the house. From the time that the police had come to the door, my mum and dad basically moved into the house to help, to support, to just be there for me and for the three kids. And then they only moved out when the kids' grandmother arrived from Australia. And by the time she left, I'd had a month had passed and we hadn't actually dealt with it. But when I went into school that Tuesday to drop them off, I spoke to the headmaster and I told him what had happened. And I said, the kids are here today. They need to be here. They need to have a break from the sadness that's in the house. And I remember speaking to the child psychologist a couple of weeks later. They got in touch with the child psychologist and I had a meeting and they were going to monitor the kids. But I remember just that I was so open. I just told anyone who asked. I was very open. I said that Josh had taken his life. I didn't hide behind anything. I didn't, and I was open to talking to people. But I do know that I remember walking down the street. It happened in Inverness, and it happened where I grew up. I remember walking down the street and seeing somebody I knew coming towards me. And this was in the aftermath, not in that first few weeks, but months later. And them crossing the road. And one of the times it happened in Inverness, there was no reason for this person to cross the road. Because they crossed to the wrong side of the road from where their house was on. And I remember thinking, you don't know how to speak to me. You don't know how to deal with me. And because it was a very complicated and confusing time, because we weren't together, but he was the father of my children. We had been together for 9 years, married for 8. So yeah, it was difficult. There was a lot of things I had to unpack, but and I'm still unpacking them, I think, now. But I definitely feel that some people didn't know how to deal with it, didn't know how to speak to us, and it was easier just to stay away or cross the road.
I remember bumping into you at the swimming pool, and our kids were having swimming lessons, and you were totally honest with me. I knew you and Josh a bit, mm-hmm. And your honesty, to me, I remember at the time being really struck by and finding it incredibly powerful. Do you think it's helped you to be honest? Hamish said truth is important to you. But do you think that pushing through and being honest about this incredibly difficult thing has helped you?
Yeah, I think I own it. This is something that's happened in our lives. It's part of our truth. And it's, being so honest, like, we've taken ownership of it. This is ours. This is our story. And more so Hamish and Alex and Mason's stories. But this is, by hiding away from it, by not being honest, it's almost a disservice to what happened. It's almost sort of belittling it. This was a huge, huge thing that happened to them, and I wanted it. I wanted to own it, and I was not going to hide away from it. I was not going to pretend that it was something it wasn't. I remember another relative of mine who had a son who was only a year older than Hamish, and he had asked me, he had called me and said, look, we're going to tell our son what's happened, but we're going to tell them that Josh was ill and in hospital. And I said to my cousin, you can do what you like, but you need to know that my children know the truth. And they spend a lot of time with your son, and he will find out that you have told a lie, that you have not been truthful. and I am not bending my truth to suit you. This is their lives. This is our story. I will do what's right for them, and that is not changing history to suit someone else.
Hamish, how much is that? I mean, that is your story, too. Do you tell it with that same kind of honesty and clarity when people ask? I mean, I presume, people do ask about other people's parents. If people ask you about your dad, what do you say?
It depends on how close I am with that person. I used to play rugby at the Highland Rugby Club, and there was one time we were going to play a game against the Gordonston private school near Elgin or whatever it is, and we didn't have a bus, so we were getting lifts from parents of the players, and I was with one of my friends, and we were heading up with his dad, and his dad was asking me questions because we hadn't really met before, so he was asking me about my mum, where she grew up, where we ended up talking about my dad, and I said that he had passed, but I didn't. If I'm just kind of meeting someone, I'll just kind of say that he's passed, or because when you say that he's killed himself, then there is that stigma, and there's a lot of kind of sympathy, and I kind of feel like pity, and it get quite uncomfortable for people. And for me, after I say that, and they're kind of like, oh, I'm sorry, that's kind of, I feel quite uncomfortable after that. But if I'm it was only, I think, last year that my friends had asked me, because I play PlayStation with them all the time, and they're always hearing me talking to my mum, but never my dad. So they asked me, are they separated or whatever? And I said, oh no, he had killed himself, and occasionally we'll talk about that stuff with him, but it's only kind of when it's a more kind of a quiet environment, if we're around at someone's house and we're just chilling and there's a smaller group of us. Yeah.
I can imagine that people don't necessarily know what response is required of them, and we often look to the people around us to try and work out how we're supposed to respond, and it is something of a bomb. I mean, that I'll use your story, but it puts an explosion, I suppose, into lots of social situations.
Yeah, I've often found myself in a situation where, because obviously I'm raising 3 teenagers, I'm in my early 40s, probably mid 40s now, but I've sort of dabbled in dating over the last 8 years or so, and that's a difficult one when somebody you're dating or someone that you've just met asks how often do the kids see their dad, or are you and their dad divorced, are they separated? And as Hamish said, when you say he killed himself, sometimes that can be upsetting for that person, because they are shocked and they suddenly feel very sad for you, and they get upset, and then you're trying to comfort them. And so sometimes it's just easier to say, I've found myself saying to people on occasion that he's just not in our lives anymore. And not because I'm embarrassed, but because sometimes I don't have to tell you. I don't know you well enough. You don't need to know this. But other times, I just don't want to upset people, because it is upsetting, because they don't know how to handle it. And then, like you said, it's awkward, or you're then trying to comfort someone.
And they don't necessarily know, I suppose, about how you feel about it. And so they're trying to navigate something that they don't really know how to navigate. How do you feel about it now?
I don't know really. I accept it. I accepted a long time ago that you know what he did. I think I'm still angry sometimes. I'm still very confused. I don't know if I'll ever have unpacked everything fully. And I have thought so many times in the last sort of 5 years, we should have done that. We should have spoken to someone as a family to make sure that we were okay, to help us understand what happened and make sure we were able to move on safely. Because I do have really heightened concerns for Hamish and his little brother, given the fact that their dad had been in such a dark place, and he thought his only way out was suicide, and that his own brother, so their uncle, also took his own life. Although the family never spoke about it. They didn't speak about it in the sense that he had taken his own life. There was still a little bit of uncertainty. And I know that played in Josh for a long time.
How, in the wake of something like this, do you ensure that everything, the memories of your dad and your husband, are not just completely overwhelmed by that final act? Is it possible to think back to the great chef, the laughing Josh, the Josh that you met and fell in love with?
It was very difficult for a long, long time. And I think the three of you probably felt it. You possibly, without even consciously being aware of it, you possibly were aware that I did not talk about him because I was angry. I was angry and I was confused. I was angry at him for not coming to me, and I was angry at me for not seeing it coming. For I had been so worried on these other occasions, and then this last time he hadn't reached out, and so I was we were completely blindsided by this. We thought he was in a better place, but so it took a long time for me to even want to remember the good things. But I think we moved up here, we sold the family home in what year? 2018. We sold it, and I needed to escape the memories in that house, because every time I looked out the sitting room window, I could see him stumbling past the window, coming home drunk, and it was just, the house was full of bad memories for me. So we sold that house and we moved up here, and it was a fresh start. And there was so much fresh everything. I didn't even take tea towels with me. I was like, no, I need tea towels. But I made a concerted effort that they needed to know their dad, that I knew, the original version, the one who was there when they were tiny and that they never got to know. And so we do talk. We don't talk about unless you wanted to talk about that time when it all happened. We tend to talk about
before that.
Funny stories, and so that they learn who he was as a person, because that's important that they know him. And it's really sad actually, because we don't have many photos we've got wedding photos obviously, and we've got photos from when they were tiny, when brand new babies and that, but we didn't, because he worked so much, we don't have many family photos. So we've got one through in the other room
Of the three
of
of us.
Hamish and me and his dad with just our feet. You can see our heads in the background because I wanted a photo just showing Hamish's tiny, tiny wee feet. And everyone thinks this is the most ridiculous photo ever. But I love that photo, and that's been out. You know, it's been framed
as far as I can remember.
since you were a year old or whatever. But you've got a photo of you and
Me
your
and
dad.
my dad. We're walking away from the camera up a ramp or something. It would have been in Melbourne.
Yeah.
No clue where else it is. But it's on my
Federation
windowsill.
Square.
Federation Square.
Federation Square. We do definitely talk a lot more in the last sort of 2 or 3 years about the early days of their dad.
It has honestly been a real privilege to sit and hear your honesty in talking about this. I think it's very, very powerful. Is there anything you wanted to finally say to each other or ask each other before I reach for the pause switch?
Do you have any questions about anything at that time, or do you want to talk more about what happened at that time?
I'd like to talk more, but I was trying to think of like questions to ask you. And like every time I think, my mind just kind of goes blank. Like I know why you were honest with us and all of that, and the questions that I have are more kind of ones that I would want to ask him.
Yeah.
If I could. And like they're the kind of questions that you don't have the answers to. Like why did he do it? Why didn't he talk to you? Why didn't he talk to anyone?
I mean, these are questions that I also have.
Mm.
You know, a lack of understanding about why he didn't reach out. I've got a letter. He left a letter, and it's out in a box of his things that I've put aside for you and Mason and Alex for when you're older. And I've never read them, the letter. Because it raised more questions than it gave answers, I think. And I remember the letter says that he thinks Mason and Alex will be fine, or Lexi as he called her at the time, will be fine, but his concerns were with you, how you would cope, how you would manage to get through it. But I mean, you can see that letter anytime. But I felt very much that it might, to me, it always read that he almost placed more importance on your well-being than your brother and sister. And I think that's why I held it back. If I upset you. Because I didn't mean to, obviously.
No, it's just like you saying about how he was worried about my well-being when he could have just not done it.
I know. And I wish he'd not done it. Obviously. But, and this is going to sound absolutely horrendous, but the way that things were over that few months, how strained and difficult things were, you know, him making threats to harm himself, and then when I would get him to someone that could help him denying that there was any issues, we couldn't continue with that. So my sister-in-law said when she found out what happened, she said she felt it was the most selfish thing he could have done, and in a lot of ways it was. And and I know that nobody probably will understand me saying this, but on some levels, for you three, for your future, it maybe wasn't. And I hate myself for saying it, but your lives would not have been as stable as I have worked so hard to make them. I have done everything I could to make sure you three didn't miss out on anything, to give you everything that you should have had. And I know there's things that I can't give you because I'm not your dad. You know, and there's some things, particularly for a boy, that he wants his dad there for. But your lives would have been so very different if things had carried on as they were. And so for that reason, you know, on some level, he wasn't selfish for what he did. Not to you three. Not for your future. Not for your emotional stability.
Hamish and Aileen, thank you very much indeed. It was a really important conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Shona McPherson has been listening to my conversation with Aileen and Hamish. Shona, I found talking to them actually really inspiring, amazing, just sitting and bearing witness to that discussion, the conversation, their relationship. What struck you about it?
I echo that. That honesty that was apparent from the start for Aileen. Maybe firstly, Hamish's pain, and particularly at the end there when he said, talking of his dad, if he was worried about my well-being, couldn't he have just not done it? And his anger and his confusion, it really brings home the impact that losing a parent or any loved one to suicide must have and does have. And how incredibly difficult to understand the suicidal mind. The fact that Josh at the time didn't feel like he had a choice when we are the one left in pain and feeling their absence. And then with Aileen, the biggest risk factor to a child after suicide is not being able for them to express their feelings and get an understanding of the death that they can live with. And Aileen talked about the lies, the hiding in her relationship with prior, and wanting to break that dishonesty and break that pattern. So just the way she spoke to Hamish and her other children so openly and honestly, and inviting this culture of sharing that was there in the podcast. I think it's so important and a wonderful model for anybody else struggling to tell their children or to talk about suicide in the family. And I believe sharing in this way will give others the courage, the confidence, the permission to do the same. So just so much compassion and gratitude to Hamish and to Aileen for allowing us into this conversation to witness it.
Thanks, Shona. So don't forget, if you do need someone to talk to or some help, you can text Mikeysline on 07786 20 77 55 or contact them via Messenger, webchat or Twitter. And the number for WhatsApp is 01463 729 000. They're open 7 days a week from 6 p.m. to 10 p.m. and all those details and links are in the show notes. Speaking of Suicide is funded by Mikeysline. This series in particular is being supported by McDonald's in the community, and the platform is sponsored by Highland-based family firm D&D Paving Limited. If you'd like to sponsor an episode or a series, do get in touch. We'd love to hear from you. Speaking of Suicide is produced by Adventurous Audio Limited.